awakening to all faithful meditators. The talk of this evening shall be based on a sutta found in the Samyutta Nikaya. The title of this talk is Uninstructed. Here, uninstructed refers to the rulings of Puthujjana. Ruling of Puthujjana, they are known as Puthujjana because they generate many defilements, and sometimes they do not appreciate the Dharma of the noble ones. They are still engaging in the low Dharma, contrary to the Dharma of the noble ones. Uninstructed ones, or Puthujjana, is devoid of learning, may not have the wisdoms to understand the profound teachings of Buddha, such as the 5 aggregates, the 12 sense bases, or 4 noble truths, dependent originations, Namarupa, and so on. So the uninstructed one could not understand the profound of Dharma well. They may have some wrong understanding, wrong view. For example, they might take the cause of suffering is because of the body. Having this body is suffering. They may have this idea that the body is suffering when the body is getting old or sick, subject to decay, and so on. So they thought they might have the notion that if they could let go of this body, then they will be free from suffering, and so on. So they do not understand that the arising of this body is also due to condition, and this body subject to change, or in other words, it is impermanent. So the Buddha say, the uninstructed ruling might experience revulsion towards this body. It means feeling of disgust. Although they may know this body consists of 4 great elements, so they may experience revulsion towards this body composed of the 4 great elements. He might become dispassionate towards it and liberated from it. What's the reason for it? It's because one could see with their own eyes this body is growing old, sometimes subject to sickness. Sometimes they could not control over the nature of body. So they might think that in this rebirth I have been taking up this body. Usually this body, one should lay down this body or put aside, because this body is growing old contracting many kind of diseases, causes a lot of suffering. One has to feed the body, or sometimes one has to spend a great deal of time and effort to take care of the body, and so on. Also, uninstructed, the Buddha said that therefore the uninstructed worldling might experience devotion towards this body that composed of the four great elements. In other words, the four primary material elements. And the uninstructed worldling might become dispassionate to it and be liberated from it. So do you think that one could experience liberation in this way? So do you think we can attain liberation of the body? Actually, the teachings say that we can only attain liberation of mind, or ceto vimutti. There's no liberation of body. The defilements is not found inside the body. The defilement is found inside the mind. The defilements such as craving, clinging, ignorance, conceit, and so on. Then the Buddha explained further. But as to that which is called the mind and mentality and consciousness, the uninstructed worldling is unable to experience devotion towards it, unable to become dispassionate towards it, and be liberated from it. What's the reason? It's difficult to realize the true nature of mind. As long as one could not perceive or realize the true nature of the physical phenomena or rupa clearly, then it's difficult to realize the true nature of the mind as well as other mental factors. So sometimes one might take the mind as permanent. One might have the notion that when a person had passed away, then the mind will be leaving this body, looking for a new home, and so on. Similarly, as long as one has not yet developed sharp mindfulness and deep concentration, one could not realize the process of mindfulness or awareness. It is arising subject to condition. It's because it's arising due to condition. That's why that process of mindfulness is not permanent. So the Buddha said, because for a long time this had been helped to by him, appropriated and grasped thus. That means there's a clinging to this notion. This is mine. This I am. This is myself. If you have opportunity to read the scriptures, you may come across this term, this is mine, this I am, this myself. This is a notion wrong due to this clinging. So because of this grasping or clinging, uninstructed worldling is not able to experience revulsion towards the mind, unable to become dispassionate towards it and be liberated from it. So similarly, during meditation, we have to overcome this notion, this is mine, or this I am, this is myself. What's the origin of this notion? This is mine, this I am, this myself. It's due to craving, conceit, and wrong view of a self. So this craving, conceit, wrong view are known as papancha, 3 kinds of papancha in the teaching. So papancha is translated as obsessions. It's also translated as impediments or obstructions or hindrances to the progress of spiritual training. They are hindrances to the progress of meditation, inside meditation. So meditators need to overcome 3 kinds of papancha in order to make more progress. So this overcoming of papancha is explained in the commentaries, Visuddhimagga, very clearly. So it's because of this clinging of 3 kinds of grasping. This is mine, is clinging with craving or induced by craving. This I am is clinging with conceit. Conceit means mana or pride. This myself is clinging with wrong view. So similarly, sometimes mindfulness meditators or Vipassana meditators may cling to this notion of myself or this I am, this is mine. For example, one meditators have the notion or idea that I see my inside clearly, and so on. Then the Buddha explained further. It would be better for the uninstructed worldling to take as self this body, composed of the 4 great elements, rather than the mind. It is because this body is seen standing for 1 year, for 2 years, or for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or even for 100 years, or even longer. It is because one could see this body as a continuous process. From the moment a being is born, you may see this being is growing up, becomes a youth, and reaching middle age, and then old age, and so on. So it seems like there's a continuous process of a person or being. So as long as one could not see the nature of impermanence, then one might take this being or self as permanent. So similarly, if one could not realize the processes of the phenomena, for example, the process of movements of rising, falling clearly, they might think that there's one and continuous process of movements. The process of rising, you continue to the next process, falling movements. Then the falling movements, you continue to the next process, rising, and so on. So this, what is being seen is a continuity of process. So in other words, as long as one cannot realize the arising and passing away of the process of movements or any phenomena, then they cannot realize impermanent. They might take these processes of movements as a permanent process or one constant and continuous process. Similarly, if one could not realize the arising and passing of mindfulness, then one might have the notion that there's one and the same process of mindfulness that has been mindful and note various mental and physical phenomena. Then the Buddha say, that which is called mind and mentality and consciousness arises in one thing and ceases in another by day and by night. Just as a monkey roaming through a forest grabs hold of one branch, lets that go and grabs another, then lets that go and grabs still another. So too, that which called mind and mentality and consciousness arises as one thing and ceases as another by day and by night. So we have experienced this paragraph in the previous talk. So the mind is never staying still with one object. Whenever there's new object, the mind will be going there immediately. So sometimes you may realize the mind is very quick. One moment you may experience happiness, the next moment there's an experience of frustration. One moment the mind is looking as a sense object. Another moment the mind is going after the present sound or voice and so on. So as long as one could not realize the true nature of the body and mind, in other words, body phenomena and mental phenomena, then one could not experience devotion or becoming dispassionate towards the body and the mind. So how does one gain liberation? If one aspires to gain liberation, then one must realize the dependent originations. In Pali, is known as Paticca Samuppada. So the Buddha said, the instructed noble disciple should attend closely to dependent origination. When this exists, that comes to be, with the arising of this, that arises. when this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. So when you could practice well the Vipassana meditation, you may can understand the significance, the true meanings of this phrase. When you study Paticca Samuppada, dependent origination, you may come across this, we can say this important formula of dependent originations. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. So how do you understand this from your practical experience or from your practice of mindfulness meditation? We have explained in previous talk. The arising of mindfulness is dependent on the object. Or sometimes the physical process is happening because it's conditioned. With the arising of the mental volition or intention, then there's this process movements are happening. So when this exists, for example, when there's rising movements, then this process mindfulness will appear immediately. Sometimes the meditation masters say that they are appearing or arising almost as the same moment, although it should be one after another. So with the arising of this, that arises. So when there's a thinking arising, so thinking is an object. So that's why there's awareness arising, cognizing or knowing there's a thinking. When there's a sound or noise appear at the ear door, then consciousness is arising. If the sound doesn't appear, then consciousness does not come to be. So as a mindfulness meditators, you have to be mindful of the internal phenomenon, in the words, that consciousness of hearing. Then you may realize the consciousness of hearing is arising and passing away very instantly. So when this does not exist, that does not come to be. If there's no rising movements, then it's not possible to note rising. If there's no falling movements, it's not possible to note falling. So when you are mindful of rising movements, sometimes you realize the rising movements stop. There's no more movements. We can say that the movements have disappeared. Then it's not possible for mindfulness staying there. But when the mindfulness and concentration are not as strong, and you put some effort to control your mindfulness, staying there, waiting for the process of falling to appear, then you may not able to see the truth of them. So with the cessation of this, that ceases. In other words, when the rising movements had disappeared, the mindfulness that's arising dependent and on that process of rising movements also cease. But you do not practice correctly, you keep your mindfulness there, then you may not able to realize the truth, to realize the conditionality. Um, so at the beginning of the practice, meditators might not able to see the process of mindfulness clearly, but they should not exercise control over the mindfulness. Sometimes some meditators worry that the mind could be wandering here and there if they do not exercise control over the process of mindfulness or awareness. For example, some meditators are mindful of the movements of lifting, pushing, dropping during walking meditation. Sometimes the lifting movement not started, they already focus attention at the heel. Then they lift up and not lifting at the same time. Then they think that their mindfulness is very precise. They can note the process movements concurrently. At the end, the process of lifting movements, they still keep their mindfulness there, and then they push the foot forward. They note it right at the beginning of the pushing process, and pushing, keeping the mindfulness with the process pushing. At the end of the process pushing, they still keep their mindfulness there. Then they drop the foot down. While dropping, at that time they note dropping. At the end process dropping, they bring their mindfulness to the back of the heel. Then they lift up and note lifting again. So in that way, they could not see the relationship between the movements and the mindfulness, because they exercise control over the process of mindfulness. When the lifting process had ended, we can say the movement had disappeared. By right, the mindfulness which is arising dependent on that process of lifting also disappear. So it is important to understand the truth, and you have to practice in the way that could lead you to realize the truth, or to realize the dependent originations, or the relationship between the mind and the body. Meditators have to develop active mindfulness, training the mindfulness to be active, alert. So at the beginning of practice, you may not able to see the process of mindfulness well. You might have to be more mindful, more attentive on the object, such as the movement rising, falling. But as you are mindful of movements of rising or movement falling, as soon as you perceive there's a clear sensation arising, at the moment of perceiving a clear sensation, for example pain, then you should mindful note pain. You should forget about the movements of rising or movement of falling. Sometimes meditators mindful of pain. When the movements of rising is getting stronger, then they come back to movement of rising. But at the same time, they put some effort to be conscious of the previous pain. They want to find out whether the pain had disappeared, or the pain is staying there or increasing, and so on. So in that way, meditators could not pay full attention to that process of the movements. So meditators need to pay full attention to one object at each moment. Even though you could not pay full attention, the mind seems like conscious of less distinct object, then you should not take interest in less distinct object. You should take interest in the strongest object or the most dominant object. And it's also important to mindful and note the mental states precisely. So it is because due to these obsessions or papancha, or this mind, this I am, this myself, then one could not make more progress. And these three kinds of papancha or obsessions together with other defilements becomes a cause for the prolonging of samsara. It's because of papancha or obsessions or impediments, then one could not be free from this cycle of birth and death. So it's important to overcome these three kinds of papancha due to the clinging to this notion, this mind. This clinging is by craving. This I am is clinging due to conceit. This myself clinging due to the wrong view. So it's because one has not yet realized the true natures of the mental and physical phenomena. So this notion arises. So during mindful meditation, first of all, meditators have to overcome the view of the self. So if meditators aspire to overcome this view of self, this is myself, then they need to develop constant and continuous mindfulness for longer and longer period of time. In other words, meditators need to develop moment-to-moment mindfulness. They need to develop concentration from one moment to next moment. It's because we want to realize impermanence clearly. We want to realize moment-to-moment impermanence. It's not the what called the superficial nature of impermanence. Sometimes you broke something, a glass, then you may say this is impermanent. But this way of impermanence can be understood by anyone. But if one aspires to realize moment-to-moment impermanence, then one must develop insight knowledge, Vipassana knowledge. And Vipassana knowledge is developed through the practice of mindfulness meditation. So when meditators could develop mindfulness from one moment to next moment, from one object to next object, if the process of mindfulness is not interrupted by thinking, wandering mind, or other hindrances such as sleepiness and so on, then meditators begins to realize the specific characteristics or the individual characteristics of the mental and physical phenomena. As explained before, meditators realize realize there's a process movements. At the beginning of the practice, you perceive or you feel the abdomen is moving, then you are able to note rising, or you perceive that the foot is moving, then you are able to mindful and note left, right, or lifting, pushing, dropping, and so on. So meditators could not overcome the concept or the idea or the form. The abdomen is moving, then I'm able to mindful and know it. But if they are able to develop mindfulness, so that the mindfulness is becoming precise, more precise to the process movements, then the movements appear clearer and clearer. Eventually, mindfulness come to perceive there's a process movements. There's only movements, and then there's a process mindfulness. When meditators perceive coldness, they realize that there's a phenomenon of coldness, and then there's a process mindfulness. But when the mindfulness and concentration are not strong enough, meditators might sense that my body is very cold, my back is very cold when the wind is blowing, and so on. But when meditators could develop precise mindfulness with deep concentration, then they begin to realize the specific characteristics or the individual characteristics of the mental and physical phenomena. They come to realize that the consciousness has the characteristics of knowing or cognizing, but physicality or the body does not have the ability or does not have the characteristics of cognizing or knowing. So they come to realize that at each moment there's a process of mindfulness, then there's a process of movements, or there's a process of mindfulness, then there's a process of pain, there's a process of the mental state, for example thinking, there's a arising of a process of awareness. Sometimes meditators might have to take mental noting or thinking or pain if the mindfulness is not strong. But when the mindfulness is strong enough, that mindfulness is including the noting by itself. So meditators begins to realize the specific characteristics of mental and physical phenomena, as well as the relationship between the mind and the body. As explained in the previous talk, we have to realize interdependence of mentality and physicality. They are conditioned each other. It's because they are conditioned each other's. That's why they are not permanent. So when the mindfulness is sustained with deeper and deeper concentration, then they only begins to realize the three common characteristics of mental and physical phenomena. As you know, anicca, dukkha, and anatta. It's not easy to see anicca, dukkha, anatta. The commentaries, for example, the Visuddhimagga explained that these characteristics of impermanence or anicca is concealed by continuity. It's because you see everything as a continuous process. It's concealed by continuities. So, when you could not see clearly, then you think there's a continuous process. For example, sometimes you mindful note pain. You experience the pain is very persisting. Sometimes it could be persisting for more than 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and so on. But the true nature of pain does not last that long. The pain is also arising and passing away from one moment to next moment. But when the mindfulness is not as strong, then you might think the process of pain is very persisting, lasting for a few minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and so on. So you could not see the arising and passing away clearly. That's why meditators need to develop constant mindfulness. When you're mindful of pain, you might have to note pain. At the moment of noting pain, you have to ensure that the mindfulness is with the painful sensation at that moment. Or then you note pain again, the mindfulness is with that painful sensation at that moment. So we meditators could realize the arising and passing away of the pain or any phenomenon, then they begins to realize impermanence. So the commentary say that when meditators experience impermanence, the meditators do not see phenomena manifested in a connected state, but rather in a state of disconnectedness. That means one object and next object is not connected, it's not joined together. For example, when meditators could see the rising process as one process, falling process as another process, there's a very subtle gap between these two processes. Then they begin to realize impermanent, but it's not yet very clear. But if the meditators' mindfulness is not sharp, they may think that the process rising is joined or connected to the process falling. There's no gap in between. Then when there's falling movements, immediately joining up with the rising movements. So it seems like these processes of movements are connected. But one who realize impermanent, then they realize as a state of connectedness. Rising movements is one process, falling movements is another process. Mindfulness that note the rising movements is one process. The mindfulness that note the falling movements is another process. It's not one single process. So only when meditators are able to develop sharper and sharper mindfulness, then they see the processes clearly, process by process. If the mindfulness is getting stronger, they realize that the rising movements is not a single process. The rising movements consists of 2-3 process of rising. Each rising movement is a process by itself. The second process of rising is another process. Similarly, the mindfulness that note the first process of rising, and the mindfulness that note the second process of rising are two different processes of mindfulness. It's because the previous mindfulness has passed away, then the next one can arise when there's an object. And beside this, meditators also have to realize that the mindfulness is arising depending on the condition. If there's no condition, that mindfulness, that process of mindfulness cannot arise. So the definitions of impermanence is very deep. The commentary has to explain clearly. Otherwise, we may not be able to grasp the truth of the impermanence. Sometimes we perceive one object has disappeared. For the pain. When the pain disappears, later on, a few seconds later, or 1 or 2 minutes later, pain arising in another place again. Then some meditators might have the idea that the same pains come back again. Or sometimes the mind is thinking about the past. The mindful note thinking disappear. Maybe 1 or 2 minutes later, the same thinking, the same contents of the thoughts appear again. Then they might have the idea that the same thinking, the same mental state is arising again. But do you think this is the same mental states or different mental states? Or do you think the pain is the same pain or different pain? So actually it's a different pain. Because when we say it ceases to be, it ceases. Ceases means does not exist anymore. It does not exist anymore. And before an object appears, or before a phenomenon appears, do you think this phenomenon is has been existed somewhere? It's also not existed at any place. So that's why commentary explained that not being existent, not being in existence, it comes to being and then ceases. So the word cease or cessation means it does not exist anymore. Or sometimes the commentary explain in a way non-existent after having been. So this is the nature of impermanent. So it's not easy to realize impermanence. You have to experience the nature of impermanent again. That's why it's known as Untitled Vipassana. You have to experience again, then you can overcome this view, this wrong view. So that's why we say that concept give us a wrong idea is everlasting. Uh, Concept, we cannot see concept, we cannot realize impermanent in concept. We cannot realize impermanent by watching or observing the form. You seeing the form is changing, is not seeing impermanent. So only when meditators could realize impermanent clearly, then they could realize the other two characteristics as well. It is said in the scripture that when one sees one of them, for example impermanence, one also sees the other two characteristics. So only by seeing this true nature, then it can help you to overcome your mental defilements gradually. When you can see it more and more thoroughly, then you make more and more progress in various stages of experiences or insight knowledge. Then eventually you may gain the supramundane knowledge. The supramundane knowledge or wisdom consists of path and fruition knowledge and enlightenment. So that path knowledge has the characteristics to uproot the latent defilements. So this evening I have explained about impermanence. So meditators aspire to develop these wisdoms, then they have to develop mindfulness constantly, continuously. Even sometimes you experience pain very persisting, or you are encountering certain mental hindrances, for example sleepiness. When you are able to mindful note constantly, continuously, sleepy, actually develop mindfulness from one moment to next moment. So when you are able to develop mindfulness from one moment to next moment, and from one object to next object, then you develop momentum of mindfulness. So it's when you are able to develop momentum mindfulness that lasts for longer and longer period of time, then you may be able to attain deep concentration and clear experience. So that's why we always emphasize that the immediate purpose of mindfulness meditation is to develop mindfulness, or to cultivate stronger and stronger mindfulness, or to develop sharper and sharper mindfulness. So I wish all meditators put forth effort, be patient. Sometimes need to be patient with some distractions, and more important is be patient with your own mind, with yourself, so that you could develop mindfulness from one moment to next moment, to develop concentration from one moment to next moment. Then you may be able to realize the true nature of mental and physical phenomena, and purify your mind eventually.